Good evening. Good evening. Before I start, I just wanted to point out that we do have a few refreshments over here on the side. There's a water and lemonade and some snacks. But I just want to start by thanking you for coming tonight. We're really thrilled at the turnout that we have. I'm so pleased to welcome you this evening, and I'm honored to be representing the League of Women Voters with such a distinguished panel that includes USD's Institute for Civic Engagement, the Violence, Inequality and Power Lab at USD's Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, the Burnham Center for Community Advancement, the National Conflict Resolution Center, and the ADL San Diego. It's really thrilling to be a part of this event tonight. My name is Rosette Garcia, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of North County, San Diego. The League, in case you don't know, is a grassroots activist organization with more than a century-long history of working to expand and protect voting rights and to ensure that our democracy works for everyone. The North County League is, we've been in the North County for over 60 years, and we just celebrated our 60th anniversary last year. Tonight, we are proud to be hosting the third in a series of community discussions addressing the rise and impact of threats directed at elected officials. We at the League have long fostered civil discourse and are concerned about its erosion, especially the rising anger and vitriol aimed at public officials because of the many harms that result. It disrupts public debate, it undermines trust, and it impairs the functioning of our institutions. And it drives people of goodwill out of the public arena. It keeps good people, maybe the best of our people, from serving. And that, I think, is a problem. We at the League have found it increasingly difficult to put together, for example, candidate forums, for which we are known, I'm sure you know. And especially like in this last election season, candidates voiced concerns about, not so much even about facing hostile audiences. That's part of the, that comes with the job. But really they were concerned about their own safety. So we're concerned about it, just as I'm sure you are, and which is why you're here tonight. So we're here tonight to talk about the current environment for public officials and to think about what we can, as citizens and League members, do to promote civil discourse and reduce unproductive hostile engagement. How does the First Amendment right to free speech operate in the context of threats and harassment of public officials? These are the subjects of tonight's discussion. So it is, without further ado, we'll start with the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce Fabienne Perlov, Director of the San Diego Anti-Defamation League, to give context to this issue and to help set up tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well? Get closer to the microphone. As Rosette mentioned, my name is Fabienne Perlov. I am the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League in San Diego County. The ADL combats hate, bigotry, and extremism wherever, whenever, and in all its form we can find it. And so we're very busy these days, from anti-Semitism to hate crimes against LGBTQ+ community members or elected officials. We're here to support the victims, to investigate incidents with our law enforcement partners, but also to work with organizations in the community to make sure that this doesn't happen again. The rising animosity of our politically divided society is really a problem for all of us. The level of threats and harassment against elected officials is really a call for action. According to the National League of Cities, 81% of elected officials are experiencing harassment, threats, and violence. 81%. Over the past several years, from disrupted meetings, sorry, I'm just making sure this woman is okay. Over the past several years, from disrupted public meetings to protests outside of elected officials' homes, ADL has reported many instances of incidents in our own states in California. Our Center on Extremism has tracked anti-government extremist activity across the state. For example, there has been anti-government militia activity from the self-styled California State Militia, is one of them, but also the 3%ers or the well-to-known Oath Keepers. I just brought here tonight this report that we just released. It's called Hate in Golden State, Extremism and Anti-Semitism in California. You can find it on our website, and you'll see some of the statistics, unfortunately. Here in San Diego, we have witnessed anecdotally a rise, the rise of targeting of elected officials, especially women and elected officials of color. Of course, this gives us a chilling effect on our ability to have a dialogue, a discourse, but also it really, stops the ability of people like you and me to run for elections. But we haven't had a good grasp on the frequency of those threats, the nature of those threats, or the impact it has on our local governance until today. Today, because with the funding of the University of San Diego Strategic Initiative Program, the Locke Institute for Peace and Justice, Violence, Inequality and Power Lab, along with the University of San Diego Institute for Civic Engagement, we have now the survey of 300 elected officials who have shared the story. They all come from San Diego County, and this survey that we're going to discuss tonight will help us understand the issues and how we can address them. So tonight we'll discuss the findings of this study, and most importantly, we'll ask you in small groups to engage in the discussions on what we might do as a community of goodwill to improve the tone and tenor of our political civic discussions. It is my pleasure to introduce Carl Luna, Director at the Institute of Civil Engagement at the University of San Diego, who is going to walk us through the program for this evening. Thank you so much.
I'm back. Tonight I'm playing the part of Tad Parson. Tad is the CEO and president of the Burnham Center for Community Advancement, and he couldn't be here with us tonight. The last moment something came up, so he asked me to stand in for him. We want to thank the Burnham Center because they've helped underwrite some of the costs of tonight's program, and the Burnham Center is committed to just that, community advancement, and you can't advance a community whose community fabric is unraveling. This is why they're interested in programs like this. How can we advance better, efficient civic dialogue in San Diego? So the program tonight, after I finish this little intro, I'm going to turn over the podium to San Diego County District Attorney Summer Stephan, who's going to give us the legal framework for this whole issue, that balancing of First Amendment rights versus public goods and safety. After that, Rachel Locke, the director of the VIP Lab, and I, and John Portman, who has been instrumental in helping to gather our data, will walk you through the study. When we're done presenting on the study, I'll call up Laura Cass-Moreno and Bob Burke from the National Conflict Resolution Center, who will be facilitators for our discussion. They'll lay out the guidelines for the discussion. We'll turn it over to you. You'll talk for about 20, 30 minutes. We'll get your basic good ideas to capture to include in our final report. We'll do a summary at the end, and then we can go out and enjoy, if we're lucky, a little bit of the last sunlight. First time we've seen sun in days. Thank you for being here, despite the fact there's sun out there. So it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce San Diego County District Attorney Summer Stephan.
All right. Well, it is my pleasure. I've had the pleasure of presenting on a variety of topics with the League of Women Voters. So it's always really good company to be here. Thank you, Rosette Garcia. And whenever Carl Luna asks me to do something, I somehow figure it out because he's a real treasure for San Diego in terms of advancing civility and advancing data and advancing proper discourse that's civilized. And, you know, I've had the pleasure of being grilled or asked questions by him, and it's always wonderful. And of course, to be in the good company of Fabian Perlov, the ADL director. We work together on advancing issues of safety for the Jewish community and all communities. So it's wonderful to be with her. And I'm going to stay. I've read a little bit about the report, but I'm very, very interested in this report that with Rachel Locke's work and Carl Luna and so many more, because it is a first of its kind. And I think that data is really important because it allows us to make decisions without just kind of using stereotypes or what we think is happening, but actually use the information to make proper decisions. I want to also introduce Yoli Apalategui. If you haven't met her, please do find time to meet her. She's our our office's director of government and community affairs, and is a real gem and really is the reason that it represents the reason that our staff and our team at the DA's office is really doing so much good that has distinguished us in terms of true service that is not political, service to keep the community safe, to advance fair and equal justice for all. So I want to kind of set the stage a little bit so you understand my perspective, and I can give you a little bit of a legal lesson on where the First Amendment and violations of law intersect, because this is a really important question that I get asked, and lots of times the community looks at different actions and thinks, why didn't someone take legal action against it? And then on the other hand, community looks at certain actions and says, you know, why is somebody taking legal action? Isn't this First Amendment? So this intersection is really complex, and Carl has given me just a few minutes to demystify this, where there's been like books written on it, but I'm going to do my best. So to just give you a little flavor of the DA's office, and many of you, especially in the League of Women Voters and people who are here are probably interested in government and in democracy. But I think it's important to set the stage. Your DA's office is your people's prosecutor. We have jurisdiction over all 18 cities, all 39 unincorporated areas. We are your people's prosecutor, your protector of any victim of crime across the entire county of San Diego. We have the privilege of serving 3.3 million people that live here and call San Diego home, and of course all our tourists that come here. Every single felony case is going to come to the DA's office for review by all 12 police agencies, whether it's Carlsbad Police, the Encinitas Sheriff, San Diego Police Department, and every misdemeanor crime is also going to come to our office, except in the city of San Diego, where they do their own misdemeanors. But we do all their felonies, and we do misdemeanors and felonies across. Now, why this is important is because it means that we get the cases that involve threats against public officials. There are sections of the law that allow the U.S. Attorney and the federal government to also act when there is a threat, but it is more specified. So we generally get most of the threat cases, and I want to tell you a little bit how we handle them. We have a special operations division. This is a division that handles public corruption and the protection also of public officials. A lot of the big fraud cases, like the big charter school fraud cases at multi-million dollars, is handled within our special operations division. if there is abuse of power by police officer, excessive force, it is handled by that division. But that division also has a lot of expertise in threat assessment. You know, personally, I happen to be very fortunate in that I spent 28 years in the DA's office, rose through the ranks to become the elected in 2018, and then now again in 2022 to serve this community. So 33 years, that's a little longer than I've been alive, not at the DA's office. Some might say that's a little bit obsessive compulsive about public safety, but there are worse things you can call someone, and I have been called worse things. That's the least of the issues when it deals with threats. But I developed a stalking division as part of my early years in the DA's office, because stalking and threats are some of the most difficult to analyze, and it is because of this intersection with the First Amendment. And I want to say at the outset, as I take you through some of the scenarios and laws, that we have to safeguard the First Amendment. If you read anything about how democracies get completely unraveled and become taken over by either extreme, it is usually taking somebody's ability to speak and speak out against something away. So we want to absolutely safeguard that. So this is not what we're talking about. The problem is that there is also a limit on words. Words can be used to educate, to object in the strongest terms. But when words cross over into actual criminal threats or criminal harassment and stalking behavior, they start to enter into a different field. But the law makes it a really high hurdle to actually prosecute. This sometimes interferes with our ability to take on a hate crime, although we've been able to triple our hate crimes prosecutions. And we take the words very seriously, and I want to draw a distinction. There is a distinction between what can be prosecuted and what should be reported. So I would say that any language that is threatening of nature, that is derogatory, that is abusive psychologically, should be reported. And the reason I say this is because when we look at so many hate crimes, and sadly, including many of the school shootings, when you look at the synagogue shootings, you will see some speech that is very hateful but does not meet the elements to be charged as a crime separate and apart, but it would still alert law enforcement to that person and allow us to do a lot of really great investigation in open source intelligence, even without needing to get search warrants, in order to unravel what else is afoot, in order to stop something violent and criminal from happening. And so what I'm going to tell you about being able to meet a beyond a reasonable doubt standard on prosecution of a threat to a public official is very different than what I want you all to report, because reporting is very important. I'll give you one example. We had somebody after the horrific Poway synagogue shooting who came to work and he praised the shooter. That's all he did. Now, that's not prosecutable. It's despicable, but it's not prosecutable. But the co-employees decided to report it. And when they reported it, our hate crime specialized division in special operations that I described to you worked with the police department to see what do we know about this person? Why is he so enamored with this horrible killer? And We saw through open source intelligence images of him with arsenals and guns and other things that even though the words themselves were not criminal and couldn't be prosecuted, the actions that were investigated led to being able to potentially stop yet another shooter and convict him of having illegal weapons and that sort of thing. That's why it's important. So now when people have speech, even though we hate the speech, we don't like it, it upsets us, they have the right to have that speech. But there are three main sections that we look at, and I'm going to give them to you because then you can start to make your own kind of legal distinctions. And the three sections we rely on when we're looking at an official that reports to us a threat that they feel unsafe, they have a threat. And let me tell you, we take these seriously, and I want to say that, I want to assure you all that even when we cannot prosecute and we explain to the public official, we're very sorry this happened, we want you to be safe, we still give them a lot of information on how to better protect themselves, how to make sure that they're safe, how to change their passage, their pathways, how to be more secure. We we don't just say, oh, good luck. We make sure that our victim services surrounds them. But I can definitively tell you that where it comes to women officials, there are many more threats that we are analyzing that are targeting women political leaders. And sadly, when it comes to our women political leaders, there is more often a sexual threat, a threat of sexual assault or rape. And it sends terror. And I can tell you when that happens, we actually view that as a crime. Because one of the legal elements that takes somebody away from a First Amendment is if they are threatening great bodily injury or death. Under the law, we consider rape, and we've won cases on that threat of rape as being a threat of great bodily injury. So it meets the definition. Now, there's another element, though, that's added to it, is that the person is able to carry out that threat. So that's how complicated the law is. So that means that if you find that the person who made the threat lives out of country or lives in another state and has made no attempts to come to the region, it's going to complicate that immediacy of the threat and that the person had the ability to carry out the threat. So we look at all the elements together. And then the third is that the person receiving the threat took it seriously and that they felt in persistent fear. And what we find sometimes is our public officials will tell us, I'm reporting this to you, I'm really not afraid. Now we know they are. But they tell us that because they want to just serve and they don't want to psychologically feel diminished. But that actually interrupts our elements. But we have to document that because we have a duty under Brady to provide information that's negative to our cases to the other side. So we have to document that the person said they weren't afraid, but then we take them through a trauma-informed interview where they actually tell us things that clearly show they are very afraid. So we disclose the negative information and the rest of the information. So if anyone ever gets a threat, be honest about whether you're afraid. It's really okay. All of us feel fear. It's just what we do about not letting it get under our skin and making us stop doing the good work that we have to do. So the three sections we use are making criminal threats. It's Penal Code Section 422. And this section, like I said, requires a threat of serious bodily injury or death, and also an immediacy and a fear by the person receiving the threat. We use a stalking section, which is Penal Code Section 646.9, when there isn't that dramatic one-time threat of, I'm going to, do this to you, kill you, beat you, split your head open. We've seen it all. But there is a persistent pattern of the person making harassment and small threats and escalating behavior and showing up, but leaving the impression at the end of it that your life is threatened and is in danger. So that's another penal code section we use for not one big dramatic threat, but a persistent pattern that ends you feeling that, rightfully so, that you are threatened. And then the last is a specific section, that's Penal Code Section 76, that deals with threats specifically to public officials. That one is a little more forgiving, but it's still tough. One of the cases that is the seminal case that we rely on is the public officials elected, or like firefighters. So firefighters arrive to this man's house, and this man then tells them, you will see what I'm gonna do. So that doesn't sound like a threat to kill, but then he exposes his arm and shows a very serious gang tattoo where they're known that when you say, wait till you see what I'm gonna do to you, it means, translation with that particular gang, is there's gonna be serious bodily injury. This is the closest case that tiptoed around between the First Amendment and it being a crime. But the jury in this case convicted, and the jury's conviction was upheld by the court, saying the totality of the circumstances, the tattoo, along with the words, along with the repeated screaming and other things that this person was doing, was an actual threat to the firefighters. So my point in this example is that we want the community to understand that no detail is too small. It's that we want the entirety of the details of a circumstance so that you can put it in the proper context, because these cases are very difficult to prosecute and very difficult to bring before a jury, even though we take care of our victims in terms of protection. Now, you might have a question about myself as a public official, and while I'm not gonna share with you details, because what I'm paying attention to every day is protecting the community and protecting other public officials, because that's my job, to make sure that they're safe and they can do their job. But there's no question there's an escalation of rhetoric and threats, and that social media makes people feel like they can say anything. It dehumanizes people. It really is a new world. And when you do see situations where the Michigan governor, Senator Pelosi, where they came to her house, you see all these situations, we take very seriously that the words proceeding and what people are saying may very well escalate. So we never take it for granted that it's just nothing. It is very important. And we don't want to become a nation where we have very few representatives. And those representatives are ones that are in a category that receives less threats, which the study will tell you about. We want representation by everybody, by every community, by every face, but it certainly feels, I think, to the people who want to threaten, feels like it's more open season and game when it is women leaders, women that are immigrants, women that are of color even more so, it does feel that way from the cases that we get in our office. And so I think it is a matter of concern, and I think there is so much power to community. If community makes it unacceptable for speech to enter, you're going to do your own breakouts, but this is my feeling. I feel that it's just like hate. When somebody says something hateful and someone laughs, you know, because they think that's okay, or makes a joke that's disparaging about someone, and someone goes along with it, that for the bully's power grows, the attention grows. So I think the responsibility of the community is to not like those comments, to not accept those as being acceptable, to set a standard that we are a nation that should speak out and express our opinions, but that entering into threats and harm to people is not acceptable. And when people don't get those likes and okays, behavior begins to change. So that's one of my suggestions, because what I described to you is that the legal standard, because of the protection for our First Amendment, is so high that we need solutions that are in the interim between a full-blown prosecution and doing nothing. We need a community response. So thank you very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to talk about our study. When my mother-in-law passed away, and she was a sweet lady, there wasn't a mean bone in her body, and I was fortunate. I had a wonderful mother-in-law. We had a great relationship. We were going through her papers, and we found a letter she had written to the Secretary of the Interior back in the 1980s, where she really disagreed with something he was doing, and she wrote some really mean things about him, concluding with, "I hope you get a voracious form of cancer and die." All right, this is from this really sweet lady. She never mailed it. She wrote it, she put it in her papers, and she moved on. Today, one click, that's out there. And that's been the issue that we're tackling with this study. I've been working on the civility issue now for about 15, 20 years, and boy, it's a growth industry. It just keeps on going. I was concerned that there's got to be some impact of all these things we're seeing in the media and what's happening with elected officials. And I had the very good fortune of meeting Rachel Locke from the Violence, Inequality and Power Lab at USD, and we got into a conversation. And she came up with this idea of doing a good, detailed empirical study. And she and her staff put together this study, and it went out to over 300 elected officials. We've got a good return rate, and she'll talk to you all about that. And like any good study, it surprised us with a lot of the findings, confirmed some of our fears, and actually made us worry a little bit more, because what we're seeing out there isn't just randomly happening. It's becoming much more organized, much more cohesive, and very threatening to local democracy. So without me spending more time talking, can we advance through a couple of slides? That was kind of the background of how we got into this. I'm going to ask Rachel to come up, and her research assistant and data guru, John Porton, will join us too, to talk about the study, and then we can get to you to talk about things that might be able to be done. I think D.A. Steffen's remarks gives us a good context. We can't rely just on law and law enforcement to solve this problem. This is an issue of community fabric, of community morality, how we can work together as a community to solve this problem. So I'm going to call Rachel up now. Thank you.
Okay, so this is not the most fun part where we share these findings that are sort of depressing, but the positive thing is that we have space to figure out what we do about it together. So that should be energizing. Can we go 2 slides ahead, please? There. So I'm going to talk very quickly about our methodology, but before I do, it's important to note it's so good that we had this discussion of the criminal threshold. In our entire study, we were not only including those threats and harassment that rise to the level of criminality. or what is prosecutable. So what we were asking people about was instances where they felt threatened, right? Even if it doesn't meet the threshold that we were talking about. So that's just important to note from the outset. So we collected data through 5 different channels. We did a literature review to sort of set the stage, and this included national as well as local information about how we're seeing threats and harassment nationwide, right? What is the context? We did a survey. The survey was sent to 328 elected officials across the county. In all of our data collection, we looked at school boards, community college boards, city councils, including and mayors, and the Board of Supervisors. So that's our pool of elected officials that we included in our study. There are some elected officials that were not included, and we can talk about the reasons, but there are some judges, prosecutors, for example, that weren't included in our study, but this represents the majority of elected officials in the county. In addition to sending out the survey, we did key informant interviews with roughly 10% of those who replied to the survey. We got 99 responses to the survey, so that's a pretty good survey response rate, actually. It's about 1/3, which is above industry standard for this kind of survey. So we did key informant interviews to get a qualitative sense of what's happening. We then did a social media review. This was a massive undertaking that John led in with a lot of work from TK, who's in the window behind you, our graduate student. They'll talk about it, but it started with almost 500,000 tweets, right? So it's a massive review. We also then did a traditional media review. The reason we did all these different data collection methods was because what we really wanted to do was have an understanding of the scope, the entirety of the universe of threats and harassment. Not just what people were self-reporting, but what was getting into the media and what social media was looking like, so that we had a really good baseline. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. The biggest takeaway finding, right, is that 75% of elected officials in San Diego County report being threatened or harassed. So the vast majority, right? This is more for women than men. This goes to the point that was made. 82% women electeds report being threatened and harassed. That's 66% for men. This is oh no. Okay. This is a bipartisan problem. So in fact, moderates were the most likely to be on the receiving end of threats and harassment at 82%, with 80% liberal and 66% conservative. This were people self-reporting, right? So we didn't look at party affiliation. We looked at people self-identifying across these categories. The moderates is interesting. There were a lot of people that talked about the threats and harassment that they received not coming from another party, but coming from within their own party. And half, 52%, of those who have received threats and harassment are considering leaving public office as a result of that. So half of our elected officials are thinking about giving up their post because of threats and harassment, but this is, again, much higher for women than for men. So it's 61% for women, 32% for men. This is one of the biggest things that we're concerned about, is that this context of threats and harassment is going to drive women and women of color in particular out of running for public office and remaining in public office. This is a big item of concern. Next slide, please. Bear with us, thank you. We've also found the trend is a steep incline, right? So people are saying that threats and harassment have increased pretty steadily since they started public service. And in fact, digging deeper, they've increased pretty significantly going back 3 to 4 years, with the most significant uptick in 2020 around a COVID-19 pandemic. almost half, 47%, report threats and harassment on at least a monthly basis. So when we're talking about 75% of people being threatened and harassed, we're not talking about one-offs. We're talking about people who are repeatedly receiving this kind of vitriol. And just think about kind of the impact that that could have if you're receiving this weekly, daily, monthly. This was an interesting finding. 23% said that they were less likely to speak their mind, so the threats and harassment were having almost a muting effect. But 14% said they were more likely to speak their mind, so an emboldening effect. I'm not going to let these people shut me up, right? That kind of reaction. This needs more research. We need to dig into this, finding a little bit more, but it's clearly having different kind of impacts on people's likelihood to speak. Now, we do have legal requirements around transparency in terms of what's spoken about in a public meeting. So there was also a lot of like, well, it's not changing the way I'm speaking at a public meeting because of the Brown Act, because we have to do certain things in transparent ways. So this was sort of the fringe who were on the side of what's required in terms of public speaking. This is another interesting finding. So I said 75% reported being threatened and harassed. Of that 25% who said that they themselves had not been threatened or harassed, half of them say it's still a central issue. And 48%, half, again, almost, say they've witnessed it against others, so against their peer. So I'm on a school board, I myself I'm not receiving it, but my peer on the board am receiving it, and I know that this is a central issue. And finally, 78% of all who replied to the survey, so these are all our survey responses, we'll talk through the other methods, believe that either all or most elected officials are threatened and harassed. Again, so even if I haven't been on the receiving end, I believe that it's happening to almost everybody else. We're going to do a quick interjection while we're going through the data with some quotes from some of the people that we interviewed. So next slide, please. And Carl is going to play another role tonight.
Things are harder now than it was previously to get people of goodwill to run for local office. When things ramped up, the board members didn't really engage in discussions in front of the public, just voted. Limited discourse because that limited the space for hostility.
Thanks, Carl. So again, people are changing the way that they're interacting with the public. You're going to lose me for a second. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, John Porton, who was the brain behind almost the entirety of the social media draw and also the traditional. So next slide, please. He's going to walk you through those components, and then I'll come back up.
Surveys are a really good first cut at understanding phenomena like threats and harassment because most of them don't leave a public record. So if you want to understand what patterns are available, you ask the potential victim pool and see who self-reports. But when you interpret survey data, you're sort of at the mercy of the perceptions of the people who responded, right? And so we worried that there might be differences in who perceives threats or harassment in which type of conduct, and that maybe that would be patterned in our political context on the gender or the race or the religious affiliation of the people who were responding. So we engaged in a couple of other reviews as a gut check against the survey results to see whether or not we observed the same patterns here. And I should say that a lot of the patterns that we're seeing, the increase in threats, the targeting of women, those things we see also in other surveys or in other documents or research that's happened around the country and even around the world. But the first thing that we attempted to do was to look through traditional media in San Diego County, newspapers, television reports of threats and harassment against local officials. And I'll just highlight a couple of things that support the trends that we found in our survey. The first is the massive uptick in the number of these incidents. We found that the traditional media between 2017 and 2019 reported somewhere between 0 and 2 threats against public officials during that time period. That jumps almost fourfold to 6 to 9 between 2020 and 2022. So a piece of evidence that we're seeing more and more of these reports. We also saw that the majority of the people who were reporting these things or who had reports written about them in the traditional media were women, 19 women versus 5 men. And so we see again that there's a little bit of evidence for the notion that women are on the receiving end of more of this treatment than men are. And the next slide I'm probably not going to have to spend quite so much time on, thanks to DA Stephan telling us a lot about the content of these threats. But on this next slide, we see some of what we found in the threats in the traditional media. We're talking about things that are relatively serious. It's not easy to slough off some of these harassing behaviors as being just something that happens in the public sphere. We're talking about targeted threats of sexual violence, of damage to a person's home. Of the 9 threats that were forwarded to the police, 5 of them resulted in formal investigations. There were restraining orders, recall efforts based around these issues. And so we are actually seeing impact in terms of what's prosecutable, in terms of what we should be thinking of as being criminal, in addition to the things that we might think of just being deleterious of democracy. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit. Oh, sorry, actually, Carl's going to. Oh, go ahead. All right, next slide. We'll talk a little bit about the social media review. As we mentioned in the literature review section, we took all of the tweets that were addressed to any of the members in our survey pool, those 328 officials we sent the survey out to. We took a look at all of the tweets that were directed toward those officials between the years of 2016 and 2022. That resulted in about 500,000 tweets, which we then scanned for what we termed abusive language. This, of course, does not rise to the level of prosecution, may not even rise to the level of a threat or a harassment as we'd perceive of it. But as DA Stephan noted, this abusive sort of language is often a precursor to a threat or an act of violence. And so our logic was that tallying up who gets the most abusive language is a probative way to understand whether what we saw in the self-reported survey results is true. Just a little bit of foundation here. We look and see that the people who, of course, receive the most abusive language are the people who are the most prominent in the community. Our top 5 are all on the city council, the board of supervisors, or the mayor. And in fact, the 2 most powerful positions in the county, Nathan Fletcher, who is the chair of the board of supervisors during a lot of this time, and Todd Gloria, the mayor, accounted for about 50% of the abusive tweets that we saw overall. And we think that this is in part because of their position. We also observed that these 2 were more likely to interact with people who became aggressive with them online, whereas most of the other subjects in our social media search tended not to respond to these things. And so this sets out a little bit of a trend right away, which is that how active you are on Twitter and how prominent you are in the community can create a target on you for these sorts of aggressive language or abusive language. And that sets out the pattern that we're going to see on the next slide. So here we can see from the whole sample, targeting this distinction between men and women, we see that the average female office holder in that 328-person sample got about 1.5 abusive tweets during the time that we surveyed, whereas the average man got 3. But if we take out Todd Gloria and Nathan Fletcher, the number of abusive tweets directed at men during this time drops to half a tweet per person. So we want to remove the outliers and talk about how we can look at cases of how prominent women are treated. And here, in this first example, you can see this pretty boldly, right? Nathan Fletcher, we know, is going to receive most of the abusive tweets that are directed toward the San Diego Board of Supervisors. We can compare instead Joel Anderson and Jim Desmond with Nora Vargas and Tara Lawson-Remmer, who tweeted about the same amount, who have exactly the same position on the San Diego Board of Supervisors. And what we see is that the women in this case get somewhere between 5 and 10 times the amount of abuse as the men. That carries through on the San Diego City Council. For the purpose of space, I didn't list everyone out. But we've got 3 council members there who, again, similar amounts of engagement on Twitter, a similar number of tweets over this course of time, and who have the exact same position. And we see that Jen Campbell is the magnet for the vast majority of the abuse. The major distinction here being that she's a woman, and the other 2, of course, are not. So from these 2 reviews, we see some backup for a couple of major implications of the survey. The first is that we see a real ramp up in the amount of abusive language or threats and harassment that have happened Over the past couple of years, this has really increased. And the second is that we see the targeting of women, in particular women of some prominence. The vast majority of people who served on, for example, rural school boards didn't get a single tweet, abusive tweet in response to what they had posted. But we start to see this vitriol really targets women with some amount of prominence. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Rachel.
So I'm actually going to ask you to go back to the last quote. Keep going to that one. So the last thing we're going to talk to you about is the interviews. So what our elected officials that we spoke to themselves said about what was happening in their own words. And I just think these are two sort of important quotes for you to see and reflect on, right? People are changing their behaviors. I don't go to the grocery store during peak hours or when there's something up for discussion that is heated, that there's an anticipation of vitriol around. People are hyper aware. So I'm more aware of my surroundings, where I am, potential threats. Hyper awareness and stress connected to it has real negative impacts on the body, on the physiology of a person, and on mental health. So these are concerning. Can we go ahead to the that one? This is important also as we're now going to be moving sort of into the what do we do about this. This quote was from somebody who received pretty regular threats and harassment, had been in the community for a long, long time serving in this role, and tried to just have a conversation, because this is their neighbors, right? These are residents of the same community, neighbors. Tried to have a conversation, said it was difficult, but some really seem to appreciate talking. So that's good. That means there's space for dialogue. That's a positive thing we should be holding on to. But also said, for some people, it was just a wasted effort. There was no dialogue that was going to be sufficient. So there's some optimism and some pessimism wrapped in this quote. Next slide, please. So this was what our interviewees told us were sort of the main topics that people were threatening them or using harassing language around. So COVID and all issues connected with that. Masking, school closures, vaccines, but also gun rights, critical race theory, DEI, LGBTQ plus issues. They said very clearly that when there's a conversation at the national level or the state level on some of these flashpoint issues, it comes down to the local level, and it's felt at deliberations that are happening at the local level. Also, these demographic flashpoints around gender, race, and intersectionality. Many people spoke about how personalized this has become. So people used to come and argue, but now it's not just arguing a point, it's attacking someone based on their gender, their race, their partisan viewpoints, maybe where they live in a community, what neighborhood they're in, who they're friends with, really just sort of personal attacks against the individual. So this personalization was really affecting people. Also, what many people spoke about, which is often not part of this conversation, is that threats and harassment are not just coming from the public to electeds. It's also between elected officials. So many people spoke about, well, I'm on a school board and I actually get harassed pretty regularly by my colleagues on the school board. So this is another pretty significant finding that also actually, interestingly, is matching some new research that's being done on the national level. As I just mentioned, huge impacts on mental health, insomnia, people unable to sleep, having to take anti-anxiety medication. People are securing their home perimeter, deciding not to run again, removing themselves from the public sphere. One thing, and I'll end with this slide here, that was hard for me as the person who was doing the interviews, almost without exception, every single person who I spoke with, who I interviewed, thanked me at the end of the interview. Not in a normal, yeah, okay, thanks for this time, it was interesting talking to you, but in a, thank you so much for hearing me talk about what's happening to me, because there's no discussion about this. and it's awful, and it's affecting me, and my spouse and I are fighting every night, and I'm terrified, and no one's talking about it. So thank you for giving me the chance to express myself. The number of times that I heard that or a version of that was almost every single interview. That's something that we should take away. That's a sobering fact. Next slide, please. Next, yeah. So this was another thing that several people brought up as well, is just that what felt like at the beginning, like just a couple people causing problems at a city council meeting or a school board meeting, has now started to feel increasingly organized, including by actors from outside of their town or their unincorporated area. People are traveling from location to location to bring up and threaten and harass on particular issues. So there's an organizational question here that needs a little bit more investigation and interrogation. Last slide, please. This is the biggest takeaway. Outside the rapid increase and the gender, I would say this is one of our biggest takeaways. Again, everyone said this. This is the new normal, but it's not normal. It's not acceptable. As it becomes normalized, it will just shift the entirety of how we do business with really significant impacts on how we conduct our democratic local governance. So again, really, really sobering. Next slide, please. I think we've already talked about all of this. The one thing that I would mention here is that the majority of threats and harassment, and this is probably interesting, are not reported. Not just not reported to police or prosecutors, but not reported to anyone. So this is a pretty concrete, I think, recommendation that can be made. Even if people are uncomfortable reporting to law enforcement, maybe they can report, if it's a school board, to the superintendent or to somebody else, where there can be a collection of information. That's not currently happening in a way that matches the scale of the threats and harassment. Most people are just, well, it's normal, so you just deal with it. You don't tell anyone about it, right? That tends to be what happens. I think I will leave it there. We've given you a lot of information. I'm going to turn it back over to Carl, who's going to turn it over to you to help us strategize and think about what some solutions might be. So thank you.
One of the findings that Rachel and her team were finding were elected officials saying, you really have to have a thick skin if you're going to be in politics anymore. But there's that old expression, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. One of our findings is people are deliberately setting those kitchens on fire. So that's no longer an operable phrase. What we need is to figure out a way to tone this down so we can get into some form of good, workable civil discourse. So I'm going to turn this over to our two great facilitators from NCRC, Bob Burke and Laura Casmarino. They're going to walk you through the process you're going to use to try to come up with some great ideas that we can capture to make recommendations to the public and to elected officials. So I call up our NCRC facilitators. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here tonight. We specifically want to thank the League of Women Voters, USD's VIP Lab, and the Institute for Civic Engagement. We also want to acknowledge the support of Live Well San Diego and the Health and Human Services Agency, without whose support we couldn't be here tonight. So what are the goals? Why are we here tonight? The idea is to create a dialogue with communities on the nature, extent, and impact of the problem of political threats directed at locally elected officials, to engage community members and leaders in developing new strategies to, 1, maintain rights of free speech and to petition government, 2, to foster greater civility in public dialogue, and 3, reduce the negative impacts of speech rising to the level of political threats on the public policy process in the San Diego region. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about the Code of Civil Discourse.
Thanks, Laura. Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you. So, research about communication and conflict and civil discourse, and now how do we do it here tonight? So one thing we wanted to share with you is the Code of Civil Discourse that's used by a lot of different government agencies in meetings all around the city and the county. So you each have a copy of this on your table, but we do want to highlight a lot of the bullet points. One thing we want to ensure is that we make sure that bullet point 1, that we are an inclusive environment tonight at our tables so that all voices are heard, diverse perspectives can be shared and understood. One of the things that we ask is that when we ask people questions, we ask with curiosity, with the desire to understand. We don't ask questions with the intent to make a point. We ask because we want to learn. The third bullet point is to really show respect for different ideas. One of the beautiful things about, I think, the work of League of Women Voters is that they want to hear all perspectives, and that's the third bullet point here, to make sure that we show respect to all of that. And then the ask is that when we share our point of view, that we explain it, because the people at your table are interested in learning it. So explain the idea to help people learn. And finally, we want to stay focused on the content and the material, not attacks personally on anybody else at our table or in the room tonight. So hopefully we can agree to the Code of Civil Discourse. If you want, I'll have a copy which you're more than welcome to take home. So at your table, if we can have all the facilitators raise their hands. So at your table, you should have a facilitator from the League of Women Voters. They're going to be the people guiding the conversation tonight. There's a few goals. One, Carl and Rachel are interested in your reaction to the research, but I also heard them say that they're taking what you share and putting it in the final report. So not just the reaction to the research, but also your ideas. How do we make this better? So those really pertinent ideas. So please make sure to share those. At the end of our time tonight, you'll have about 35 minutes to talk at your tables. So at the end of your time, we're going to go around. We're going to ask each table to share one bullet point of wisdom that they shared out loud with the whole group. But all of the notes will go back to Carl and Rachel for inclusion in the report. So when we do go around at the whole group, and we'll remind you, we're asking for 20 words or less, the most important nuggets, so that everybody has a chance to share out, but we don't take too much time. All right, with that, your facilitators have our guides. If anybody has any questions, Laura and I will be coming around. If you are at a table with just 2 or 3 people, if you want to hop up and move to another table so that you can have a robust discussion, please feel free to do that. I think that's a great idea. All right, thanks, everybody.
I think the most important part of these conversations is the recommendations that you all have to make. So we're going to be going around from table to table asking for recommendations in 20 words or less from the designated spokesperson, and we're going to be then also collecting the reports from the facilitators. So we ask that you not repeat something that has already been said, and that you limit your response. So can we start here?
Yes. 20 words. Policies and procedures applied consistently. Security and law enforcement resources available. Stop intolerant behavior early on by calling it out.
Thank you so much. So we like to say, see something, say something.
So what we discussed was setting expectations at the beginning of meetings. So to open every meeting with a statement about what the ground rules are for civil discourse.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, we had very similar conversation here where we talked about ground rules specifically for meetings, and if you violate the ground rules, you're warned once, and if you violate them again, you're done. And to keep things moving, to keep things civil.
Thank you very much. Okay.
We talked about training for the boards and members, elected officials, and that training being on how to conduct a meeting and how to use this code in running the meeting and in giving it to the people who are going to speak at the meeting.
Thank you. All great ideas. You speaking? Okay, you've just been voluntold.
So we had one of our major themes was also about setting ground rules and a code of conduct that was agreed upon at the outset. And I'll just add that we ended with, we were talking about just more clarity when decisions are made locally, maybe doing a little more to inform the community of the whys behind whatever changes are being made, just to hopefully enhance understanding of the whys of changes and decisions being made around town.
So part of that would sound like more education and information. Thank you.
We also talked about code of conduct, but we added an element that not only do we mention that, but we also remind those in the audience that we are here as public servants. We are your neighbors. We are part of your community. We're family. We're friends. And just to instill in everyone, we're viewing this as a public service. We also thought, just one quick note, that any opportunity to engage on an issue before the meeting, just some brainstorming sessions would probably alleviate a lot of the tension beforehand.
So increased dialogue. Thank you. And back here.
Thank you. Ditto to the training, and ditto to ensuring that protocols and rules are followed, and that discourse is civil, and one way to do that, we think, would be to have a parliamentarian who says, that's not the way we're supposed to do this. We're not doing it this way.
Great, thank you. Did I miss anyone? Did anybody have something that they really want to share out?
So I have one. So we also were responding to the presentation itself and thought that this was important information. And one of our takeaways was that this is a local issue and it should be more widely spread.
Thank you. Yeah, and a lot of people, I sure didn't know what the statistics were.
One of the people in our group mentioned that she wrote a thank you letter to a mayor who had handled a very difficult issue. And I think thank you letters to members of boards, etc., from time to time from constituents is not a bad idea.
Great idea. Nice to be told that you're appreciated every so often.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I really loved our table because we had 3 elected officials and 4 or 5 non-elected officials, and I think it's really important. I think we learned that some people don't know that there are rules already. We cannot delete some Facebook posts or social media comments. We're not allowed to delete those. We do establish and have, Brown Act rules, Robert's Rules of Order, where there are policies and procedures in place, but they're not followed. And the mayor is in charge of. I'm a city council member. My mayor is in charge of the conduct of the meeting. And when people are out of order, it's on him to make those comments to the people and keep them in order. And sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. So how do you enforce that when your city manager and your city attorney are employees of the council and they don't want to stand up to the council members and tell them they need to do a better job? keeping the meeting in order. So we have some squishy issues that we know because we're sitting there that sound like they're easy to fix, but they're not.
Thank you for that impression. And we do a lot of trainings about how to provide that information without. Any final comments? Thank you all for your participation and your wonderful recommendations. It's great to hear.
Thank you, everybody. Tip O'Neill was famous for saying, amongst other things, all politics is local. And you've identified there is a serious problem in local politics. And if we don't fix it, it's going to infect and be reinfected by politics at all levels. Our democracy is in danger from the things we're looking at. Your suggestions are wonderful. We're going to be going through your notes to include all this in our final report, which we're writing as we speak. We'll be issuing the report this summer. We'll then be looking with additional funding to expand our project in the fall and look at some of those other offices that we weren't able to serve this time around and look about trying to replicate this in other areas. Democracy only works when people of good faith participate in it to keep the people, and there are people of bad faith who would like to subvert democracy. And I can't thank the League of Women Voters enough for supporting this program tonight. I don't think there's an institution that I know of in San Diego that is more supportive and constructive for democracy than the League of Women Voters. Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank the National Conflict Resolution Center for providing us two wonderful facilitators tonight. Nice round of applause. And Rachel Locke, John Corton, TK, Tori, Lennox, Luna back there. Really great people. This is the people who put together this phenomenal study, and I greatly have been honored to be able to work with them. And so stay tuned, and we'll have more to come out. And meanwhile, tip your servers and get out of here. Good night.